What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've covered the external war with the US, I've covered Iran's own economic collapse and protest movement, but there's a third front in this conflict that I haven't given proper attention to yet, and it's genuinely significant. Thousands of Kurdish fighters based across the border in Iraq have launched actual ground operations into western Iran. Iranian forces have reportedly evacuated entire border cities, and months later, this insurgency is still escalating, with fresh ambushes, casualties, and a brand new armed group entering the fight just weeks ago. Let's break down how this started, how far it's actually spread, and why a government already fighting the United States externally and a currency collapse internally now has to worry about an armed uprising along its western border too. I'm going to walk through how this Kurdish offensive actually began back in March, then the groups involved and what they're actually trying to accomplish, then the escalation that's continued through the summer with fresh clashes and a new armed group, then Turkey's role watching all of this nervously from next door, then how this connects to everything else I've covered about Iran's internal pressures, and finish with my take on what a genuine three-front crisis, external war, economic collapse, and now an armed insurgency actually does to a government's ability to keep functioning. Back in early March, an official from the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan told I-24 News that Kurdish fighters affiliated with the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, began taking actual combat positions inside Iranian territory starting the night of March 2nd. According to that same official, Iranian forces evacuated the border city of Marwan on March 3rd and began establishing defensive positions in and around the area, meaning Iranian security forces were pulling back from actual population centers rather than holding ground against this offensive. Separately, the Jerusalem Post reported that Israeli and American officials confirmed hundreds of Kurdish fighters had begun ground activity inside Iran from areas near the Iraqi border around that same period. According to Kurdish sources cited in that reporting, these forces had been preparing to participate in ground operations in western Iran, specifically to pressure Iranian security forces and force them to disperse across multiple fronts simultaneously, exactly the kind of multi-front strain I've been tracking throughout this entire war. That same reporting noted contacts had taken place between the Trump administration and Kurdish figures, including a direct conversation between President Trump and Kurdish leaders in Iraq, as well as leaders of Iranian Kurdish opposition groups, suggesting at least some coordination or encouragement from Washington around the timing of this offensive, even if the actual fighting was being carried out entirely by Kurdish forces themselves. Iran's IRGC denied these reports at the time, stating they were aimed at undermining security and stability in Iran. But Iran's own intelligence ministry separately confirmed a very related story just days later, saying it had struck positions of Kurdish fighters accused of preparing to enter the country through its western borders, describing an operation carried out jointly with the IRGC that destroyed bases and ammunition depots. That statement itself is worth noting. A government publicly confirming it's actively striking armed groups along its own western border is not the language of a government dismissing this as a non-issue, regardless of how they characterize the broader offensive claims. I want to explain the groups involved here because Iranian Kurdish opposition politics involves several distinct organizations, not a single unified movement. PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, is closely allied with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, that's fought Turkey for decades and is designated a terrorist organization by Ankara and much of the international community. PJAK's armed wing is called the YRK, the Eastern Kurdistan Defense Units, and that's the group that's shown up repeatedly in reporting on actual clashes with the IRGC throughout this year. There's also the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, whose Peshmerga fighters have been directly involved in some of the more recent, deadlier clashes, and the Kurdistan Freedom Party, another separate armed faction training in bases near Erbil in Iraq's Kurdistan region. And then there's a genuinely new element that's emerged just recently, a group calling itself Zori Hiwa, or Son of Hope, which claimed responsibility for a targeted assassination in the city of Pave that killed 2 IRGC members. One analyst covering this specifically noted that when a new group's name appears in this kind of context, it's often just a way for an existing armed faction to claim a specific operation under a fresh banner rather than representing an entirely new organization from scratch, which is a genuinely useful piece of context for understanding how fragmented and how deliberately opaque this whole landscape of Kurdish armed opposition actually is. Here's what I think is the most important detail in this entire story. This isn't a single dramatic event from back in March that faded away. It's continued escalating in real, documented clashes stretching all the way through the summer. By late June, Hengal, a human rights organization that closely tracks Kurdish issues in Iran, reported multiple armed clashes between YRK fighters and the IRGC in several cities, leaving at least 7 people dead including 3 Iranian military personnel and 4 YRK guerrillas. That reporting specifically named an IRGC sergeant and a young conscript killed in one confrontation, and separately described a firefight at a checkpoint near Baneh that killed at least 2 more Iranian security personnel. Then, just weeks ago, Fox News Digital reported that the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan said 6 of its own Peshmerga fighters were killed in what it described as an IRGC ambush near Piranshah in Iranian Kurdistan. Majid Glai, president of the American Kurdish Committee, gave a quote that I think captures the actual significance of this entire ongoing story better than any single statistic could. He said what he's hearing is that this is not business as usual. This isn't like periodic clashes on the border. This is operations, and it seems to be deep inside. That's an important distinction. Sporadic, low-level border friction between Kurdish opposition groups and Iranian security forces has actually been a recurring feature of Iranian politics for decades. But the language coming out of this specific wave, actual military operations, government forces evacuating cities, deep territorial penetration, describes something meaningfully different in scale and ambition from the historical baseline. I want to bring in an important regional wrinkle here, because it's not just Iran and the Kurdish opposition groups involved in this story. Turkey's defense ministry has publicly stated it's closely monitoring the activities of PJAK specifically, given that group's direct affiliation with the PKK, which has fought a decades-long insurgency against Turkey itself. Turkish officials explicitly framed groups like PJAK as negatively affecting not just Iran's security, but the overall peace and stability of the entire region. That's a genuinely important geopolitical wrinkle sitting underneath this entire story. Turkey has its own long, complicated, and often violent history with Kurdish separatist movements, and a resurgent, better organized, better resourced Kurdish insurgency succeeding against Iran creates real risk of emboldening or resourcing similar movements that could eventually turn attention back toward Turkey's own restive Kurdish regions as well. That's exactly why you're seeing Ankara publicly signal concern about this offensive. Even though Turkey isn't itself a direct party to the broader US-Iran conflict, they have their own separate, long-standing interest in making sure Kurdish armed movements anywhere in the region don't gain too much momentum or too much external support, regardless of which government those movements happen to be fighting against at any given moment. I think it's worth explicitly tying this back to the broader picture I've built up across this entire series of videos. I covered in an earlier video how Iran's government is simultaneously managing an active external war with the United States and a severe internal economic crisis, currency collapse, runaway inflation, and a protest movement broad enough to include bazaar merchants, students, oil workers, and truckers. This Kurdish offensive represents a third, genuinely distinct front layered on top of both of those existing pressures, an actual armed insurgency, not just economic grievance or political protest, operating along a strategically sensitive western border region. One analysis I found put this dynamic about as directly as possible, describing Iran's internal fault lines as widening rapidly while the IRGC is already stretched thin by the regional war. That's exactly the kind of compounding multi-front strain I flagged as a real risk in my video on Iran's domestic economic crisis. A government that has to simultaneously fund and staff strike response operations against the US externally, riot and protest suppression internally in cities like Tehran and the bazaar districts, and now sustained counterinsurgency operations along an active Western front against organized, combat-experienced Kurdish fighters, some of whom, per that Jerusalem Post reporting, may have received at least tacit encouragement or coordination from Washington itself. I think it's worth explaining that this isn't a conflict born purely out of the current war. Iranian Kurdish opposition to the government in Tehran has a long, often violent history stretching back decades. Groups like PJAK have periodically clashed with Iranian security forces for years, well before any of the current tensions with the US began, and Iran's government has long accused Kurdish opposition movements of receiving support from external actors, specifically to destabilize the country's western provinces. There have been previous incidents over the years of Kurdish rebels killing IRGC commanders and besieged militia members in ambushes near cities like Oromia in West Azerbaijan province, so the basic pattern of armed Kurdish resistance operating from bases in Iraq's Kurdistan region and periodically striking into Iranian territory isn't new. What's different about this current wave is the scale, the sustained duration, and the timing, launching a coordinated offensive specifically while Iran's government is simultaneously fighting an external war with the United States and managing a severe domestic economic crisis. That timing is exactly what makes this feel like a deliberate strategic decision by these Kurdish factions to exploit a moment of maximum strain on the Iranian state, rather than simply another isolated flare-up in a long-running, low-intensity conflict that's persisted in the background for years, regardless of Iran's broader geopolitical situation. I also want to think through what these Kurdish factions are actually trying to achieve here, because it's worth being clear-eyed about the realistic strategic goals rather than assuming this represents an attempt at full regime change on its own. Historically, groups like PJAK and the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan have pursued goals ranging from greater autonomy for Iran's Kurdish regions to, for some factions, complete independence, though the movement has never been fully unified around a single shared objective. Given the realistic balance of forces involved, thousands of lightly armed fighters operating from external bases against an Iranian security and military apparatus that, even after months of external war, still numbers in the hundreds of thousands, a full military victory or the toppling of the Iranian government through this front alone is very unlikely to be the actual near-term goal. What's much more plausible is exactly what earlier reporting suggested, using sustained pressure along this border to force Tehran to divert resources, attention, and security personnel away from other priorities, whether that's the external war effort, the economic protest suppression I covered in my other video, or both simultaneously. That's a strategy of attrition and diversion rather than direct conquest. And it's exactly the kind of approach that becomes more effective the longer a government is already stretched thin managing other simultaneous crises, which is precisely the situation Iran finds itself in right now, according to everything I've covered across this entire series. All right, here's where I land on this one. Out of every thread I've covered across this entire series, I think this Kurdish offensive might actually be the most classically effective pressure tactic being applied against Iran's government right now, more than any single night of airstrikes. Opening a genuine, sustained ground front along a country's own border, forcing that government to divert security forces, evacuate cities, and fight an organized insurgency using troops and resources that would otherwise be available for external defense or internal crackdown operations, is about as old and proven a strategic pressure tactic as exists in the history of warfare. The fact that Kurdish forces have apparently sustained this campaign for months now, not just a single dramatic March headline that faded away, tells you this represents a genuine, durable third front, rather than a brief opportunistic strike, while Iran's attention was elsewhere. I also think Majid Glai's comment that what's happening now isn't business as usual and represents actual deep operations, rather than routine border friction, deserves to be taken seriously as an informed assessment from someone who tracks this specific issue closely. Combined with reports of actual Iranian government forces evacuating population centers rather than holding them, that's a meaningfully different picture than the periodic, contained border skirmishes that have characterized Iran's relationship with its Kurdish opposition for decades. Whether this offensive ultimately achieves anything close to its apparent strategic goal, forcing Tehran to disperse and weaken its overall security posture at exactly the moment it's most stretched by the external war and the internal economic crisis, is something I'll be watching closely alongside everything else in this conflict. So that's the third front running underneath everything else I've covered in this war. Thousands of Kurdish fighters launching a sustained ground campaign into western Iran back in March that's continued escalating through the summer. Iranian forces evacuating border cities. Fresh clashes killing IRGC personnel and Kurdish fighters alike as recently as this month. A new armed group entering the fight, and Turkey watching nervously from next door, given its own long history with Kurdish separatist movements. Combined with the external war against the US and the internal economic collapse I've covered in other videos, Iran's government is now managing genuine crises on at least 3 completely separate fronts simultaneously, and I think that combination deserves a lot more sustained attention than any single one of these threads gets on its own. I also want to leave you with a thought about how these 3 fronts likely interact with each other, rather than operating in isolation. A government fighting an external war has to keep meaningful military resources forward deployed and ready to respond to further American or Israeli action. A government managing a severe internal economic crisis and a broad-based protest movement has to keep meaningful security and intelligence resources focused on domestic surveillance and crowd control in cities like Tehran. And now a government also has to keep meaningful trained counterinsurgency forces committed to an active western border region against organized, combat-experienced Kurdish fighters. Every one of those 3 commitments draws from the same underlying pool of personnel, funding, and leadership attention, and I think the compounding strain of managing all 3 simultaneously, rather than any single front on its own, is genuinely the most important story running underneath this entire war right now. Even if it doesn't produce the same kind of single dramatic headline that a missile strike or a currency collapse number does on any given day. What do you guys think? Does a sustained internal insurgency like this change your read on how much longer Iran's current government can keep managing all of these pressures at once? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. If connecting these different threads together is what you come to this channel for, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep bringing you this kind of deeper analysis. Check out the video right here next. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.